Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. The Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that in May 2017, workers in the San Antonio-New Braunfels metropolitan statistical area had an average hourly wage of $22.21, which comes in at about 9% below the national average and 4.5% below the state average of $23.42. It's also lower than Austin Round Rock's average of $24.92, Dallas-Fort Worth Arlington's $24.64, and the Houston The Woodlands Sugarlands at $25.87. In addition, the San Antonio region's wages were lower than the national average in 12 of the 22 major occupational groups, including legal, construction, and extraction, as well as personal care and service. To learn more about all that, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News business reporter Lynn Brezosky. So, Lynn, thank you for joining me here on the podcast. While it, of course, doesn't affect workers across the entire city, let's start with a recent minimum wage increase at a well-known employer in San Antonio and then kind of work our way through the rest of the story.
Yeah, so hi, Chance. Nice speaking with you. And yes, the Board of Trustees of the Alamo Colleges District, which is a network of 5 community colleges, it's one of the 10 largest government employees in the San Antonio area, decided to raise its wage floor for full-time employees from $11.50 an hour to $15 an hour. So the colleges employ about 6,000 employees. This would only affect those on the very low end of the wage scale. And that's followed similar $15 an hour minimum wages enacted for the city of San Antonio, Bexar County employers, as well as several local school districts. And a lot of this is as a result of community groups telling the city for decades now they don't want tax dollars used to support poverty wages. We see the same thing going on in cities across the nation, Seattle, California, some East Coast cities. So San Antonio is just kind of following that pattern of, hey, we need a living wage. And that's, what it is to just kind of pay for the basics: housing, transportation, childcare, medical, just the bare basics. And the difference in Texas is that state law prohibits municipalities from enacting laws that would force private employers to pay above the federal minimum wage, and that's $7.25 an hour. So groups such as Communities Organized for Public Services, or COPS, Metro Alliance, have been focusing on the public sector, and in some cases, the companies that contract with the public sector employers as well.
So as you just kind of alluded to, and also as you recently wrote about online at expressnews.com, you wrote that the Alamo College's wage increase wasn't entirely altruistic. So you've talked about some of those factors already, but I'm wondering about how that particularly played out with the Alamo Colleges.
Well, to start with, the unemployment rate here in the San Antonio region is only 3.4%, and it's not much higher for the state and nation. I think it was 3.8%, last jobs report. So it's not like San Antonio is lower than any place else and people can come here. It's a job seekers market pretty much across the board. And every month and in between, whenever I talk to employers or read surveys that the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas does, the message is employers are saying, I just can't find enough qualified workers, or in some cases, even unqualified workers. So when you've got an administrative assistant or a facilities worker, and I interviewed one of each a couple of weeks back, they're looking around. They're making less than $15, and they're realizing, hey, I could make at least $15 at these other places, and even more with some of the larger private employers. I think USAA, it's a large insurance company based here in San Antonio, has a $16 minimum. So if you're the Board of Trustees at Alamo Colleges, you're realizing that you could be losing some good people. So that the market force is saying we need to keep up here. We need to raise our wages.
So, kind of piggybacking on that, in your article, San Antonio is described as a cheap labor town. You were talking about how people at Alamo colleges, probably many other employers, maybe could shop around, certainly if they weren't happy with what they were making currently. So, that all being the case, there is some discrepancy even in similar jobs at different companies. And then, of course, from one industry to another. So, I'm wondering if you could kind of just give a broad outlook on what type of money you could expect based on different types of jobs in different industries in San Antonio. I know that there is quite a discrepancy depending on where you're looking.
Across the board, it tends to be low. Legal professions, for example, was 21% lower. That jumped out, but there were a lot of different reasons for that. But in terms of it being a cheap labor town, you just have to look at the big industries in San Antonio, and it's office workers, it's food service and restaurants, supporting our tourism, home health care. These all tend to be lower wage jobs than, say, manufacturing jobs, or Houston's got a lot of jobs supporting the oil and gas industry. We have about 50% more than the national average in customer service jobs, which I interpret to mean call centers. We've got a lot of those. We always seem to be opening new call centers. We've got a lot of medical secretaries, a big medical sector. And again, that's a job that pays below the national average wage. And one thing our economists have found, local economists, is that we have a lot of low skill workers. Only about 25% over 25 have a bachelor's degree, and that's not much better than it was in 2009. So there's plenty of jobs for low skilled workers, and the opposite is true for high skilled workers. They are in demand. And when I was researching this story, it turns out that this is something that dates back decades. I guess the original president of Cops Metro Alliance, a guy named Andrew Sarabia, said that back in the 70s, he found evidence that San Antonio's Economic Development Foundation had commissioned a study, and the executive summary said more or less, we don't want companies that are going to interfere with our wage structure. We've got a good thing going here. This is what we can market ourselves as, low cost labor. And I think the city is still trying to move past that.
So, aside from wages themselves, there are, of course, other things that kind of play into the whole outlook here. And one of those big factors is the cost of living. Now, that has been increasing. I've done a lot of reporting through the podcasts available at expressnews.com/podcasts on the increasing cost of housing and the lack of housing in the San Antonio, New Braunfels area. So, how does something like cost of living affect the wage outlook for people in San Antonio who are working in these different industries that you just described?
Well, the cost of living may be rising, but again, if you compare it to other metro areas, San Antonio is still going to be a little bit lower, and that's where things kind of even out. This is almost a decade old. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas does a study, and what they do is they say, okay, what's a comparable city? What are our comparable cities? What has sectors that we have? Like, we have a lot of military, we have some aerospace, we've got a lot of tourism, we have got a lot of trade related, close to Mexico, healthcare. Let's look at some cities that are similar to us. And so they came up with Atlanta, Indianapolis, Orlando, Phoenix, Sacramento, San Diego, San Jose, and Virginia Beach. And when you looked at just the per capita income, San Antonio comes in last. We also include Austin and Dallas because they're also in Texas. They're kind of close, but San Antonio came in last. But when you adjust for the cost of living, San Antonio came in sixth, so kind of more or less the middle of the pack. So I talked to Keith Phillips. He's one of the chief economists there at the Dallas Fed, and he said, that's pretty much still the same. The cost of living may be rising in San Antonio, but look at San Jose, look at Austin, and things still look pretty good here.
As you pointed out earlier in our conversation, Texas law prohibits mandating private employers to pay above the federal minimum wage, which is currently at $7.25 an hour. And that has meant that in San Antonio, the fight has often focused on making local public entities increase their wages. We've already talked about San Antonio colleges. You talked about City Hall. Overall, do you think that's been an effective strategy? There obviously have been some victories in that area.
It would appear so. I mean, it's kind of been like some dominoes right now. I mean, we had the city, we have the county, we have several school districts now, and now we have the community college district. So whether it's economics or whether it's pressure or a combination of both, it seems to be working. So these workers there are, pretty happy. I did a calculation for a wage increase from $11.50 to $15 an hour over a year. Even after taxes, that's going to be well over $6,000. So that could be a used car, that could be several months' rent. It's a big deal.
And of course, something that could be tied to wages, yet is absolutely its own beast as well. The ongoing debate over sick leave in San Antonio. And just like with wages, with sick leave, you have people on both sides of the equation. So when it comes to increasing wages, what do those against that point to as to why that's a bad idea? You've already kind of mentioned how that might change maybe the atmosphere of companies looking for workers in the San Antonio area, because as you pointed to, historically, wages have been low, and that's kind of led to certain types of industries.
So right, it comes down to with the paid sick leave and with mandating a minimum wage are you forcing the private sector, are you dictating how to run their businesses, and does it really, really help? I spoke to an economist, David Newmark. He's over at the University of California, Irvine, and he's written at least 2 books on the subject. And he says there's not much proof out there that minimum wages actually help low-income families. In other words, low-income families, you may have cases where nobody's working, and that's the problem. Minimum wage earners tend to be teenagers. In fact, about half of minimum wage earners are teenagers, so they're part of a family. It's just spending money or maybe savings for them, but they're not supporting a family on it. Or they could be spouses of moderate to high income wage earners. So the question is, who is the minimum wage really helping? Newmark says, things like the earned income tax credit is a lot more effective. But then you're dealing with the tax code, and people don't like messing with the tax code, and who is that hurting? But what happens, according to those who've studied it, is these companies, for example, out in Seattle, who suddenly have to raise their minimum wage, they're not going and laying off people en masse, but they are cutting hours. And another interesting thing they're finding is that companies are less willing to bring on unskilled people. For an example, if you have a dishwasher who's already trained, fine. But if you're going to have to train somebody from the beginning, you're going to be reluctant to hire that person because you're paying them a pretty high wage, a higher wage than before. But they have to go through all this training, and you're not getting much back. It's all pretty new, so I really don't know where it's going to go. But minimum wage debates have been going on for more than a century now, and I don't think we're going to solve it anytime soon. But we are seeing more and more cases where we can study it and see how it affects the larger regional economies.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News business reporter Lynn Brezosky for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.